Thank you, Sandra. And thank you all for coming. I certainly didn't expect too big a crowd at the end of the centennial year, so I appreciate you being here. And as Sandra said, I hope we learned something today. Some of you may not know, but I don't even live in Crestview. I live in the south part of the county in Shalimar, but I can actually drive here from my house quicker than I can to downtown Fort Walton. But no lie. But after being and working here for so many years, over 25 years, it's been one of the best parts of my life of the 45 years I've lived in Okaloosa County. And this has been a joy for me to not only be the Centennial Chairman for the year for the city and the CRA, but to be able to learn even more about the city of Crestview and the surrounding area. First of all, I'd like to give Cal Zethmeyer from WAAZ, WJSB credit. The slides are all his. He helped me put them together when we did the original program, and we've kind of tightened it up a little bit today, so I do hope you will be able to enjoy it. The first thing I want to talk about is what Florida looked like back, this is 1822, when you see there were only 2 counties in Florida. Because the population was so small, the division was, right now you could see that's basically the division of Northwest Florida, because the Northeast is a separate kind of area versus the central and the south part. So back in 1822, there was no such thing as Walton, Santa Rosa, or any of those. But eventually, with the growth of population in Florida, the smaller counties started to develop. But this is what it looked like back in 1822. By the time about 1853, you see that other small counties had grown. Holmes County is in there. And what we have here is what existed in 1853 is Walton County, and to the west of it, Santa Rosa County. There was no such thing as Okaloosa County. And the fact of the matter is that that is the way it remained for the next 50 or 60 years until the growth of the central part of the 2-county area became an issue as far as traveling and being able to carry on business. Between 1853, 1855, and 1915, North Okaloosa was very active and growing. Basically, the historic trades industries that we know about, turpentine, lumber, and all forms of agriculture. One of the reasons for the growth, both the cause and the effect of the growth, was the railroad. Right here you see the Pensacola and Atlantic Railroad in 1885. And originally there were like 4 or 5, maybe 4 stops between Pensacola and Jacksonville. But eventually, as the population grew and there were needs for more services, more goods along the line, the little towns developed. And oddly enough, you'll see there's about 5 miles apart. Right today, there's more than 5 miles between some cities because, as you know, some of the little villages that were important at the time and started to exist became defunct. Harold, for instance, is a place in the road on Highway 90, more or less. But if you look at that, you can see that the many little towns there that grew up, and instead of only 4 or 5 stations between Pensacola and the Atlantic Ocean, there were many, many more, between 20 and 30 at least to start with. But the reason is that the crews that were building and working on the railroad could only work and go about 5 miles a day. So every 5 miles or so, they would stop and make camp for the night and maybe leave some supplies behind as they came back and forth across there. But eventually, they found a place that was just about the highest of all, and that was on the crest of a hill with a great view. And that became Actually, that's what it was, and it was 2 words. It was Crestview. So this was in 1885, but then if you look even a few years later, in 1898, you'll see not only was there that major east-west railroad, but you see the Yellow River Railroad going from Crestview up towards Laurel Hill because of all of the turpentine and lumbering industry that was up there, the growth of the population and everything else. So by now you see the population has grown quite a bit in the last 30 or 40 years, from the 1850s to the 1890s. And at that point, there were more and more people. And this was not what the station looked like back in 1885, 1890, well, whenever it was originally built. I'm not exactly sure of the year. This picture was from about 1927, but the original structure, you get an idea of it. 1892, okay, yeah, and that's on the fine print in my maps. I didn't read it. Very fine print. Okay, so that was the railroad station that eventually we had in this town. And you can see this picture is much later because of the size of the building that's right next to it, right there. And then, in the course of the time between the 1890s and the 1920s, there was major development, not with many historical events or so, but let's take a look at a little bit of things that were part of the civilization at the time. This, of course, was the again, the cause of people coming and the effect of people coming both was, there was land available, and then the people were coming to take advantage of it. And this was an ad that was in the paper for the Crestview Land Company. And I don't see any prices on that one, but I can probably guess that we're more like $5, $10 an acre, something like that. Because life, of course, was built on a different economic scale at that time. Another example, if we go to the next, this is the limo service of the day. The jitney, as we called almost all the vehicles then, jitneys. I remember my father was a bus driver back in the 1920s, and that's what they did call them, jitneys too. But this is the, if you needed to have a hitch, $2. Each way, that wasn't bad, straight through. And there was a schedule there, so for a very small amount of money. This was 1918, and the News Journal was the document. Actually, the News Journal existed from that time in the teens of the 20th century until in 1980s or 90. I know, because I had the very last newspaper it was, and I gave it to the Baker Block Museum because they didn't have any. So, but Cal, did they have those bicycles for rent too, do you think? I thought only circus clowns rode those, but nevertheless. Oh, and then if you were shopping for groceries and you only had a couple of dollars, maybe a couple of silver dollars, you could still get more than enough to eat. So here's an example of Garrett's grocery store that had stores in both Crestview and Milligan. Remember now that Crestview was a latecomer as far as bustling towns, with Milligan and Baker and Laurel Hill, all three were a lot more full of life and people than Crestview until that it became more of a hub for the railroad. So this was, oh, and I love when people complain about Highway 85 now. We could still be in that position. And I know there are still some roads around here left to look like that, but fortunately not with the traffic of Highway 85. So this is one I would like to do something with this, say, quit your complaining, we've come a long way. I get a kick out of the letters to the editor in the bulletin from people who obviously have not lived here very long. And they're, why don't we have 5 or 6 more roads going through this land out here? There's all this space. Well, yeah, but if we had 5 or 6 more roads, there would be, nobody could afford cars to drive up and down it because the base would be gone, the federal land, that is. So at any rate, this picture actually was from 1927. This is the home of W.H. Maples and his family. And I think the reason I picked it, because I used to look like that little girl that's standing up with the hair. But there was another reason as well. This is the family home before it was painted, and the little girl that's kneeling down is Ernestine Maples, better known to some of us that are older as Ernestine Barker. Ernestine was a regular at city council meetings and never, ever left a meeting without something to say, and was a driving force for several issues in the city of Crestview. So, and I did get to meet her, so I felt this picture was something I wanted to use. And then we come to Daddy, Bill Maples. Now, the reason he's called the father of Okaloosa County, let's picture ourselves around 1915, 1916. And remember, we had two counties. So Milton was the county seat in the western side in Santa Rosa County, and Defuniak Springs was the county seat in the Walton County. Just about everybody had reason to go to the county courthouse. But if you lived in that central part where the county line was between Santa Rosa and Walton County, if you lived in that central area, picture that one landmass from Santa Rosa County western end to Walton County eastern end, those people who lived in the center had quite a trek to go to a courthouse. So in this case, we're talking about Mr. Maples was a resident of Walton County and was a member of Florida House of Representatives for this area at the time. And he recognized the problem that people had getting to the courthouse. If you lived in that remote area in the middle, which is along the Blackwater River, the Yellow River, you had to first walk someplace or ride a mule, or if you were lucky, have a horse to go. And you probably had to go to a junction of a river and take a boat ride. And then on the other end, if you had to leave your horse behind, you had to hire another horse or a carriage or something to take you all the way to the courthouse. So we're talking about not jump in your car and get to the courthouse in 10 minutes. We're talking about a day. And some people might have even had to find a way to stay over if they couldn't get home the same day. Because the story of your life was written in the records in the courthouse. And whether it was property, whether it was recording all the history of a family, births, marriages, deaths, everything, all of that was in the courthouse, as it still is. But the unique thing about it, and I was fortunate enough to work in what we now can call the middle courthouse, the one that was built in 1953. The courthouse was basically a very much the center of the towns that they were located in, the county seats. People had to come there for so many reasons, and the joy of my life was working in the old courthouse now, the 1953 one that's still standing, at least the exterior, when people came in freely and were able to go from one office to another, and it was a social scene that I will never forget. It was one of the greatest places to work. My office was in the cellar, in the basement, and it was like three remodelings ago, and to walk up the stairs, and as I got to the top of the stairs, Howard Hilburn's office, the door was open right there, and Howard waved, come on in, and pretty soon, well, Buck was already out of office, Doyle was in office, Doyle Hilton, and he would see me walk into Howard's office, he'd come over, and we'd have a chat, and it was the friendliest and greatest place you could. You didn't have to go through security, you didn't have to do anything, you just came, and it was a pleasure to come to the courthouse. People would pop in the office just to say hello. That's where I learned so much about history, because Rhett Ensor was one of the people who used to come to my office because I had a history book that went back to the origin of the county in 1916, and all the important things were recorded in that as far as the courts were concerned. So you could come in and look to see who was arrested for having still been found in his backyard, things like that. Oh, there was some interesting names that did that. And then also Rhett had a fabulous memory. somebody was arguing with him one day about who was sheriff in such and such a time. And he came in and he said, I got to see that book, Miss Pat, I got to see that book. And he'd say, now I know the sheriff was then. And we'd find the page, and sure enough, that's who was the sheriff at the time. And because he knew everything. And of course, then he would sit down and we'd talk for half an hour and I'd learn even more. But that is what the courthouse was like. I give you a little bit latter day example of it, but that's the way it always was. No more. But I'm glad I had a part of it. At any rate, Mr. Maples was very interested in making life a little easier for these people that lived in the central part of this two-county region. So he set upon himself to have an election of the affected people who lived in a certain section of Santa Rosa and a certain section of Walton County to agree to be part of a new county, Okaloosa County. And then, as it still is today, it has to go through the entire legislative process. And he was very successful in having the election pass in 1916, and then a year later, within the next year, the process of the county seat was had to take place. So at this time, the picture is of Okaloosa County with the boundaries that you see today. Now, one of the things that I learned so much about this, we had 2 or 3 opportunities this past year, and if you ever hear about it again, you need to go see it. And that's a presentation by Jim Moore, who does one. And our opening event for 2016 was a presentation on Crestview being selected the county seat in 1917, and the fact that Jim represented Maples, and he did a presentation on Friday night and another one on Saturday. The whole room was set up at Warriors Hall with a scene of timely scenarios of the early 20th century. And of course, both in costume with the proper scenery on the stage. You could, after 5 minutes, you would believe that Mr. Moore actually was Bill Maples. So much so that after the second presentation, the first night he did a question and answer and a chat with the audience, but he did it as Jim Moore, 2016. But the second day, because it was in the afternoon when a lot more of our older residents were able to attend that afternoon, it became 1917 again. He spoke as Bill Maples in 1917, and the people in the audience responded as residents in 1917. I, unfortunately, was laying in bed sick as a dog and did not make the Saturday afternoon one, and I was sorry I hadn't, because I heard that was about the best part of it. But Mr. Maples worked tirelessly until he formed this county. And then in the following year of April the 11th, 1916, when the county was chartered, within the following year they had election. And of course, like some of the political races today, there were cities that became candidates to be the county seat. Cities that were far more, I don't want to say sophisticated, but they were a little bit bigger and a lot more busy. And that was Laurel Hill, Milligan, and Baker. And Crestview was the 4th candidate. But by, I don't know, anybody here then? I don't remember. But actually then Crestview won that election, not by a whole lot of votes, but they did win, and that became the county seat. And that, some of this history, and it comes from the Forkland, and it is so thick, it took me almost 2 years to go through it. But I pick it up and do as much as I could, put it back down again. And a lot of this information comes from in that book itself. But what was really noble about those 2 women who did this marvelous job on that book, because they are at a point now where it's not possible for them to go through and make any additions or revisions to it, kind of add some things that have come to light since then, they actually gave the rights to that book to the Historic Preservation Board of the City of Crestview to allow them to be able to, and Cal and I are both members of that, Linda Parker is, who's here, and we have been able to use that as a fundraiser by the fact that between the Baker Museum Director Ann Spann and Cal, the cover has been remodeled, revised, and the inside front covers, the front and back covers and the inside covers as well. Nothing was done to the book itself. It's in its original part, but it has a more permanent cover than the paper one that was originally on it. So it is a valuable piece of history to have. It really is. And this, I think this is such an elegant portrait. I would use it, but this is the fact that this was the style of it and everything about it. It was one of the most elegant courthouses in Northwest Florida. It really was. And the text under there shows the people who were involved in the design and everything else. And the construction began in 1917 and was completed in 1918. $32,000. The plans cost even more than that. The committee that met to come up with a design cost more than that. I think we're up about 32 million now, aren't we? Yeah, I think it's 32 million. Anyway, so between the 1920 and the second, and probably 2016, we've had events that World War I and Crestview and the North Okaloosa County definitely sent their people to fight in that war, came back, fought through the Depression for survival, and then when Mr. Plew arrived from the Indiana-Chicago region in the Midwest to this Vale of Paradise in Valparaiso, and the few officers wandered down from Montgomery to go hunting and fishing, and decided, well, gee, this is such a great place. We'll get this to be a summer place. Well, maybe we can find a mission to put down here. And in a very tiny nutshell, that was the beginning of Eglin Air Force Base and the addition of the National Forest that was added later on. So now the federal land extends through the the eastern end of Santa Rosa County all the way through Okaloosa County to the western end of Walton County. And that, of course, was one of the reasons why in 1970 we had such a population spurt. As a matter of fact, that's when I got here as one family of 1,000 being sent here at that time. And that was a lucky day for me. At any rate, between the two wars and the growth of the south part of the county, interesting to note, there was a gentleman who was in office for many years, John Vaughn, and he, in later years, he lived right close to me. Actually, he lived in a house on Don's Bayou, which had originally been his fishing village, and he was a tax assessor for many, many years. And a tax assessor at the time also did elections in his spare time and did a lot of what the clerk did, because at that time there were only 3 constitutional officers until another revision of the Constitution. So Mr. Vaughn used to, when I had to go down to the south part of the county into the office in the Water and Sewer Building, or as they used to refer to it, the Taj Mahal, which was far from a Taj Mahal, I can tell you that. The fact of the matter is that he came to get a new voter card or something one day and sat down and talked with me, and that was probably, when I saw him coming in the office, I just made clear anything I had to do and sat down with him. And he was the one who told me about, his house on Don's Bayou basically was originally his fishing village, because people in the north part of the county, they had the common sense enough not to go live on the shoreline, build a building on a shoreline, or worse yet, on a barrier island. So consequently, there were people who owned There's some in Okaloosa County, Mr. Sykes, and a few others. And, but then, so ordinary people were able to obtain some property that was just for the taking, practically, along the shoreline in Walton County, and built little concrete block houses with jalousie windows, things like that. But those were strictly for recreation. They were built to weather bad storms, concrete block, jalousie windows, nothing permanent inside about them. Anything could wash through if they wanted to, and it would still be there. But the fact of the matter is, the environmental philosophy of today shows that you're building on barrier islands. You may find yourself getting out of bed and putting your feet in water some mornings, you know, things like that. But also that it was not developed. It was strictly recreational purposes. And then there were people that came to Destin, yes, in Fishing Village, you know, the story of the historic luckiest little fishing village, and the Destin and Marler families, and families in Mary Esther primarily, and then a little bit later on in Fort Walton Beach, the staff and families, things like that. But all of the business and mainly social and civic life was in the north part of the county until the expansion of the military bases from the Second World War, and they won't call them wars, but I will, the wars that followed, the Korean War and the Vietnam War, and the war that's still going on everywhere. But that was the time that the, let's say the lights went out a little bit more in the north part of the county. And as you recall, if you see some of the pictures that are hanging in City Hall, and my favorite one is the one that looks up Main Street with the courthouse at the far north end of the street, and all the cars and parked on Main Street, all the people walking around, and all the busy stores and shops and bars and restaurants and things like that. The things that attracted people to the middle of town. No, I'm not going to do a commercial for CRA. And no, they were anticipating what I would say next, I know. But the fact of the matter is, things went downhill a bit. But then we come, and I think I missed, this is the 1953 courthouse, and we talked about the town center. At one point, they built the annex. I have to tell you this aside. The annex, the Shalimar Annex, the property was given by the Meigs family to the county because when the county commission met always in this courthouse, and then after a while in the 70s, basically in the late 60s, they started to have a little bit more population down there. So once a month they went to this Fort Walton Beach City Hall to have their council meeting down there. And it was a much, much less formal one. And at the end of the meeting, they let anybody speak who wanted to. At any rate, once the population really started, there were 90,000 people in Okaloosa County when I moved here in 1970-71. And so there was nothing. We had everything. We wanted to order something. We had to go to Pensacola to buy everything, or Panama City. But the annex was built. If that wasn't the worst building I ever saw in my life. The only thing the destruction was the best thing that ever happened to it, because the only thing holding it up was the mold. I'm not kidding you. I mean, I could come to the first thing we had to do is dust everything off in the morning from the black mold that was around. But it was a sorry piece of building. Anyway, it was gone. So when people thought, oh, you have to go to the courthouse in Crestview. That, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, that was the joy of my life, going to this building right here, when you could walk in the front door, or you could go in the side door here. It didn't make any difference. Okay, so with 2/3 of the land in the middle owned by the federal government and the growth of the south part of the county, we faded a little bit up here, but never mind. Living in the shadow of the south might be said by some people, but what I tell them is you just wait. And I'm glad I lived long enough to say, I told you so. Because I love being around the mayor of Fort Walton Beach to remind him that Crestview is the biggest city. And, oh, well, we already do that. Our Christmas parade is bigger than theirs. And our fall festival has as many people as their Billy Bow legs, so we don't care. But with the, as of course, the sad part of it was after a certain point, with the economy going the way it did in prior to even 2007, when missions at Eglin started to decrease. First of all, the number of airplanes went from, it dropped by 500%, I swear. But the fact is, eventually, with BRAC preserving as much as it possibly could, and of course bringing the 7 Special Forces Group airborne, Crestview blossomed. New buildings, new people, people looking forward, and 6,000 to 7,000 more people in the course of the 5-year span since they've been here. The fact of the matter is we are now the largest city, have the best schools, new subdivisions, new industry. People in this room that are involved in those things know what I'm talking about, but I can tell the rest of you that Crestview is a shining star, a fine way to end our centennial year. Now in 2015, 2016, we see where the Board of County Commissioners, with 2 county commissioners from the north part of the county, were able to convince the others it's time for a new courthouse. Oh, sorry, I'm carried away. But the fact of the matter is, one of the prominent things that I think happened in the last 15 years here was the renaissance of this building. I say renaissance because it came this close to being torn down to make a parking lot. And there were people who were so adamant about parking that they neglected to look at history or the future. But I can tell you, because 3 of us that are sitting in this room were a vital part of the historic part, Cal and Linda and myself, of convincing everyone that we had to save that building. And we worked through the National Historic Register, and it helped that the Secretary of State of Florida was one of my best friends. And he made 3 visits over here, and he himself, it was Kurt Browning at the time, he was a former supervisor of elections, and before that, he was a very prominent businessman in Dade City, Florida, in Pasco County, and he was an aggressive member of their Main Street Association and their CRA and everything else. So when he came and saw the possibilities, as we did, of this building, we did preserve it, and then a few years after the preservation of it and the fixing, actually, if you remember, it was a different color, and the Public Works Department had it sandblasted, and the sandblasting is what caused it to not pass the final test of the National Historic Register. However, we have been able to get a plaque that shows its certification of it at any rate. And where that car is parked, way on the left-hand side, there is a door that's just blocked, is boarded up. But that was when this building was built as the Alitex building, the cotton and fabric factory. The agreement was that that's where City Hall would be, so that was the entrance to City Hall for many years. And we have a plaque that was put by the front door of it, but the plaque exists and it's supposed to be put down by that door, so that's a project that we keep saying we're going to do and we haven't done it yet, so we will. But this is now, of course, the Florida A&M University Rural Health Center or something like that. Darrell Peden one. Darrell Peden was our House of Representatives member and then the Florida Senator, and was the driving force to be able to get FAMU to become the owners of this building and maintain it. It's a beautiful building inside. I remember before, when it was still a factory, we had political rallies inside the factory. So they let the workers have the candidates come in. And I walked in there the first time I ever went in there, sometime in the 80s, in awe of the floor and the wood and the beams and everything about it. So it's wonderful to see that that building has been saved. And of course, it's been greatly enhanced since this as well. But to get back to where I interrupted myself, this is what our Board of County Commissioners has finally determined we will have. And the progress is slow, as most things that government have to do in compliance with regulations that the paper would fill this room as far as being compliant with regulations. Right now, they're in the process of asbestos mitigation and other things to, before they can tear it down. All of that asbestos has to be handled in such a way that nobody breathes any of it in, even though we worked in there all those years. So at any rate, they tried, and that again was another move by the Historic Preservation Board, was to, instead of a quite modern type structure, to incorporate as much, if you remember that beautiful picture of the original 1918 courthouse, it encompassed as much of that facade to resemble that kind of thing with the columns. And of course, the requirements for a courthouse now with the way prisoners are handled. I mean, I walked the halls many times and saw, I'd be right next to prisoners with chains and shackles. The worst thing was Thursdays when they brought all the little kids in chains. And when I say little kids, I mean 14, 16 years old in chains and shackles right past my office door. And so to get on the elevator. So this one, the security of it was paramount. The regulations that the Supreme Court of Florida requires to be done for the judges requires that you can't just walk in the door and see friends either, but it'll be nice when you get in there. But we do have a new courthouse, and those of us who are in both Historic Preservation and Main Street Crestview Association are looking forward when this building becomes something we can go into and plays a big part in the revitalization of Main Street. Now that's the subject of a whole nother meetings another time, so we won't go into that. But this then brings us up to date with the end of the centennial year of Crestview. And just at this time, let me see, I've got a couple of minutes left. A little review of the events that we had this year. The City Council, sitting as the commissioners on the CRA board, the Community Redevelopment Board, in 2011 decided that they would fund the year of the centennial. And they put aside $10,000 each year in 2013, 14, and 15 for $30,000 for us to spend for the centennial. And because that was going to be an event-filled year, they asked Main Street to be the agency that implemented, and I was the chairman of that, and we had a wonderful committee. Oh, it started out with 40, ended up with 3, 4, Ray and me and a couple others. And but it was an exciting year. January we had the Crestview becoming the county seat with Jim Moore. February we had a centennial ball at the Elegant View, which is the new home of the Fred Astaire Dance Studio. Then in March we did provided the entertainment for Triple B. In April we had our star event of the year, and that was the Centennial City Birthday Party, and we had it on April 16th, the closest Saturdays to the 11th. And because of the fact that the commissioners were aware that any official groundbreaking would probably have to take place in bad, cold weather. We came together, the city and the county commission, and put on the birthday party. And the company that was contracted to build the new courthouse provided a tent and a lot of things. The county provided the stage and all of the elements that we work with the county and the city. To me, the star of that show is sitting right here, Mayor Cadle. He was the MC who did an absolutely fantastic job. And I made sure, having been part of the county for so many years, that they all understood. I poked my finger right in their chests and said, this is a city event. This is a city event, the city of Crestview's birthday. And they respected that. And I think we had one of the most successful city-county events we ever had. And it was, we had birthday cupcakes for 1,000 people. We had the city of Crestview, the high school culinary arts department do 500 of them. That was all they could manage, so I got another 500 from Publix. But we had, and that was part of the, it was the event that opened the Spanish Trail Cruisers car show. So we had things going on all day long. There were vendors and everything else, so it was a great birthday party. In May, we helped sponsor the MARC, the Military Appreciation and Recognition Celebration. And July 4th, we had an old-fashioned picnic with fireworks at Twin Hills Park. In October, we had the Ghost Walk, which is what we started to call it, but it was the Spirits of Crestview, which we thought, oh my gosh, we hope at least 50 people show up. Well, I'm sorry, but we were a little overwhelmed with like hundreds and hundreds of people. And I'd say that was the one event we've had people come back and say, we want to do this again. But when you only have 100 years of history, I mean, I don't know what else we can do unless we make some history real quick. But we'll come up with some other kind of theme. We'll go see where all the stills were or something, I don't know. Start out at the distillery. Then we had the Fall Festival, and the biggest one we've ever had. We had between 12 and 15,000 people this year. And we helped put on the Veterans Day Parade. In other words, they used our insurance. And then our Christmas parade from Saturday night, which again was a wonderful event. So after this, I want to show you the coins that Betsy has. This is a commemorative coin. This is the front side of it. There's two sizes. There's one this is a $5 one. There's a $10 one that's bigger, and that's the back side of it. And Brian Hughes, who at the time was at the Bulletin, is now with the police department. He actually designed the logo. I think the railroad, which is the major reason why Crestview became the hub city, was very significant about it. And we appreciate all the work that we got from everybody this year, that's for sure, and to the city of Crestview for their money and their support. By the way, we did not spend all their $30,000 either. I myself only spent probably 10, that's all. All the events we put on, and it was a labor of love, it really was. So I appreciate your listening to this today and hope you learned something out of it too, even if it was how much mold there was in the courthouse.